Revenge with Karen.
Non-essential staff can skip the merger call, the email read. Virginia blinked once, then again. It was 11:07 p.m. and she was still in the office, sipping reheated coffee that tasted like betrayal and burnt toner. Her eyes scanned the words like they'd crawled out of a wormhole. Non-essential. Non-essential. As if she hadn't just spent the last 8 months orchestrating a $400 million acquisition, so delicate it made brain surgery look like IKEA assembly. She clicked on the calendar invite. Her name wasn't on it. That's when she knew. Someone upstairs either had a death wish or a wildly miscalculated sense of their own importance. Probably both. She let out a laugh so dry it could have sanded drywall, then leaned back in her chair, staring up at the water-stained ceiling tile above her desk, the one that always looked like it was about to fall but never did. Kinda like her career. Before we go deeper, real quick, if this kind of story hits close to home, corporate insanity, clueless new execs, silent power moves, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and throw a like on this. It really keeps our small team caffeinated, emotionally stable, slightly less likely to quit our jobs and raise alpacas in Montana. Anyway, Virginia, 7 years. That's how long she'd been quietly running the firm's M and ops like a backstage magician. No press releases, no executive handshakes at the ribbon cuttings. But every deal that didn't implode into a flaming crater of lawsuits, that was her. Every surprise risk mitigation that made the boardroom nod, her. Every whisper to legal about a clause no one remembered signing. You guessed it, her. She wasn't flashy. Hell, she wore the same gray wool cardigan so often the interns called it the Constitution. But she was necessary. She knew where the documents were buried because she'd buried them herself. She didn't need credit. She needed accuracy, control, and a legal department that didn't have an aneurysm every time marketing made up a new slogan mid-deal. And this new merger, this was the Mount Everest of acquisitions. Private equity, international tax codes, an earn-out clause tighter than a Tupperware lid from the 80s. The kind of deal that made careers or ended them. And Virginia had prepped everything. Red flag reports, compliance trackers, internal briefing decks, pre-cleared valuation ranges. It was all there, humming like a finely tuned V8. She'd even caught a nearly catastrophic error in the buyer's audited revenue statements, duplicated line item that overstated gross receipts by $22.4 million. Quietly flagged, quietly fixed, never made it to a single call. But if it hadn't been caught, the deal would have tanked, and their firm would be eating lawsuits for breakfast. So imagine her surprise when Trent the Temporary, aka the new interim COO, barged in with all the grace of a frat boy at a yoga retreat. Straight from a failed fintech startup, hair too perfect, eyes too hungry. He wore words like synergize and disruption like they meant something, like he'd ever closed a deal that didn't end in a Medium apology post. From day one, he had no idea what Virginia did, which didn't bother her until he started rearranging meetings she usually ran, streamlining documents she'd handcrafted, and referring to her as a legacy bottleneck during a lunch meeting she hadn't even been invited to. But she stayed cool, because that's what she did. She didn't raise her voice. She just filed everything away in that mind of hers like old receipts in a fireproof box. Quiet, steady, deadly, until that email, non-essential. She read it again, then a third time. And that's when she replied with one line, "Then your acquisition lead is skipping too." She clicked send. Then she shut off her phone, packed up her folder, the real folder, and walked out of the building with the same calm gait she always had. No flinch, no fire, just silence. She wasn't quitting. She was demonstrating, like a breaker being flipped in a server room, not out of spite but precision, like everything else she did. By the time her office chair cooled, chaos had already started to bloom like mold under a cheap laminate desk. And she went to bed. Because tomorrow, gravity was going to do her job for her. Trent showed up like a surprise colonoscopy, uninvited, painful, destined to reveal problems nobody wanted to deal with. He was 38, allegedly, though he had the kind of face that looked like it came out of a startup incubator freezer, smooth, blank, and refrigerated. Ex-founder of a disruptive platform for decentralized fulfillment, whatever the hell that meant. Translation: he'd burned through $11 million of venture capital, killed his own company, and somehow failed upward into her firm as interim COO. His first words at the all-hands weren't even greetings. They were directives. We're here to shed legacy thinking, flatten the curve of inefficiency, unlock latent agility. Virginia had been in corporate long enough to smell fresh bullshit from 50 feet. And this was artisanal, cage-free, grass-fed corporate fertilizer. Still, she played her part. Nodded, took notes, smiled just enough, even fixed a glaring inconsistency in his org chart before he embarrassed himself in front of the board. Didn't even sign her name to the correction. But it didn't take long. First, he started canceling meetings that she led. No explanation, just blank calendar space, and a regroup later message from his assistant, a trembling ex-influencer named Paige, who once asked Virginia if escrow was a skincare brand. Then came the reshuffle. Wanted all departments verticalized. As if Virginia hadn't spent 6 years deduplicating the exact inefficiencies, he was now reintroducing like some kind of corporate time traveler with a fetish for bad ideas. He cut finance out of pre-approval loops, told legal to trust the spirit of the deal, suggested that procurement could be merged with customer success, because, in his words, they both work with people, right? And then the kicker, Friday night email blast, just as Virginia was finishing up red lines on a counterparty agreement that Trent had somehow signed before it was reviewed. Subject, Monday merger call streamlined attendees' body. To reduce friction, only essential leadership will join Monday's buyer side call. Please consider this meeting invite final. Non-essential staff may prioritize Q4 ramp plans instead. She read it twice, then scanned the invite list. Her name wasn't there. The room went cold. She stared at the screen, heart rate flat, but something behind her eyes sharpened, like a switchblade pulled slowly from a drawer. She didn't scream, didn't march into his office. She just stared, non-essential. This wasn't just petty. This was suicidal, because Trent didn't realize what Virginia did. No, he thought she was old school, kind of relic that gets thanked in farewell speeches and replaced with Slack bots and Canva slide decks. He didn't know she drafted the counterparty interview scripts, that she personally reviewed the buyer's debt position and flagged the exact liens they needed to structure around, that she owned the only working model that integrated their earnout clause with the client-side performance metrics. Without her, this merger was a house of cards built with oily hands during an earthquake. But to Trent, she was legacy code. In his mind, this was a cleanup job. Sweep out the gray hairs, install fresh thinkers, slap Agile on a few dashboards, and ride the deal to a real C-suite title somewhere flashier. He didn't want smooth execution. He wanted credit, headlines, a LinkedIn post with just enough vague humility to sound noble while elbowing the world with "look what I did." Virginia knew men like him. Hell, cleaned up after men like him for years. But this one made a fatal error. He tried to run the show without reading the manual. And Virginia, she was the manual. The email sat there, bold and smug. She imagined him pressing send like he'd done something smart, something bold. Probably sipped his protein shake afterward, proud of himself for decisiveness. She minimized the window, took a slow breath, then opened her reply. One sentence. Your acquisition lead is skipping too. She clicked send, stone-faced, calm. Then she shut her laptop and let the storm gather without her. The message didn't bounce. No delay, no soft fail, no spam folder. Just that small, crisp ping that let her know Trent had opened it. Read receipt confirmed. Timestamp, 11:16 p.m. Virginia closed her laptop with a soft click, the sound oddly satisfying like the seal on a jar of pickles. Final. Vacuum tight. No room for interpretation. She didn't rage, didn't fume, didn't pace the hardwood floors of her tiny downtown apartment like some cliché rom-com exec with a glass of wine and a playlist called Soulful Empowerment. She brushed her teeth, ran hot water over her coffee mug, set her alarm, went to bed, slept 8 hours straight. Because unlike Trent, probably spent the night refreshing Slack and wondering why legal hadn't replied to his quick cue about signatory authority, Virginia knew exactly what was about to happen. At 8:04 a.m., the merger call began. At 8:09 a.m., legal pinged her. No read receipt this time. Her phone was off, stuffed in the bottom of her purse like a dropped grenade. At 8:12 a.m., one of the buyer's analysts asked a question about revenue thresholds and performance clawbacks. A question that sounded simple, until you remembered that Virginia was the only one who'd ever aligned the buyer's KPIs with the legacy data from their acquisitions arm. At 8:14 a.m., Trent gave his first non-answer. That's being finalized by our strategic ops team. We'll circle back post-call. At 8:16 a.m., finance pinged legal. Where's Virginia? 8:18 a.m. The buyer's counsel asked why the newest escrow structure in version 4.2 contradicted the risk tolerance disclosures in version 3.1. Legal blinked. Finance blinked. Trent smiled like a substitute teacher who just got asked to explain quantum mechanics. At 8:21 a.m., legal emailed her again. Urgent missing clause signatory. At 8:24 a.m., the buyer's side called for a brief pause. 8:29 a.m., legal walked into Trent's glass-walled office without knocking, voice low but sharp enough to cut drywall. Where is Virginia? She wasn't required on the call, Trent said, blinking like he'd just learned the stove was hot after touching it. You idiot, legal snapped. She owns the escrow triggers. She's the named acquisition lead. Her sign-off is baked into the contract structure. Trent looked pale. But she's not essential, he murmured, almost to himself. Legal stared at him like he'd just admitted to deleting the Constitution. She's the only reason the buyers didn't walk last quarter. She built this deal like a damn Swiss watch. And you just threw out the battery. Elsewhere, Virginia stood in line at the DMV, holding ticket number B197. A toddler was screaming nearby. The coffee machine was broken. And she had never felt more serene in her life. Wasn't that she wanted the deal to fail. Quite the opposite. She wanted the deal to work, but she wanted everyone to see, in real time, just how quickly the structure collapsed without its keystone. She wasn't sabotaging the building. She'd simply walked out the front door and left them to realize which floor held the weight. At 9:06 a.m., she walked out of the DMV with a new license, a faint smile, and 0 voicemails, because she'd disabled notifications. At 9:11 a.m., the buyer's team sent a formal request for documentation clarification. Virginia's name appeared 4 times in the footnotes they cited. At 9:22 a.m., Trent, now sweating through his very slim-fit dress shirt, told legal he would loop back after regrouping. At 9:37 a.m., the CFO, usually too aloof to notice anything below the stock price, texted her personally, "Hey Virginia, can you join us real quick?" She didn't respond. At 9:42 a.m., her phone rang again, then again, then again. Virginia watched the screen light up. Legal, CFO, Trent's assistant, even one from an unfamiliar area code, likely someone on the buyer's team. She turned it over face down. Let gravity do its work. Let inertia speak louder than panic. This wasn't rage. This wasn't revenge. This was a demonstration of absence, of weight, of quiet authority. She made herself coffee, real coffee, French press, sat on her balcony, listened to the city wake up, and somewhere inside a boardroom wrapped in floor-ceiling windows and even bigger egos, her ghost was haunting them already. By 10:14 a.m., Virginia had counted 72 missed calls. Not texts, not Slack pings. Calls. Old school, desperate, oxygen mask on a plane calls. Her iPhone screen looked like a CVS receipt of corporate incompetence. Legal, legal again. CFO, CFO again. Trent's assistant. An outside number she suspected was the buyer's junior counsel. Her favorite was a voicemail transcript from someone in finance that just read, "We're F. Ed." Meanwhile, Virginia was B211 in line at the DMV. The overhead screen had just called B204. Progress. She sipped her vending machine coffee, burnt, acidic, perfect, and watched a guy in a sleeveless tap-out shirt try to register a dune buggy as an emotional support vehicle. It was the most honest thing she'd seen all month. Back at headquarters, the meeting room was thick with stale coffee and flop sweat. The buyer's team was patient, up to a point. They had their own deal stress to manage, but they expected answers. And Trent, God bless him, tried. First question was about the adjusted valuation method Virginia had devised, one that incorporated post-pandemic retention dips while still keeping the earn-out clause appealing to both parties. Trent blinked, nodded, and said, right, the hybrid linear valuation schema, which wasn't a thing. It sounded like a thing, but it was as real as his leadership skills. Buyer's counsel cocked an eyebrow. Is that documented anywhere? We're told there was a conditional override spreadsheet that tied the valuation to projected client churn thresholds. Trent glanced at legal. Legal blinked. That spreadsheet was, Virginia's. She owns it. Own, Trent muttered, too quiet. I'm sorry, asked the buyer's counsel. Trent straightened. She's been reassigned to lower priority initiatives. Streamlining. There was a pause. One of those awful, airless pauses where people decide whether to laugh or run. Buyer's lead finance rep, A woman named Sonali, who had 3 Wharton degrees and 0 patience, asked flatly, "So who's walking us through the valuation trigger contingencies?" The room froze. Trent tried again. "We're finalizing those, with input from multiple stakeholders. It's more of a collaborative initiative now." Translation: he had no idea and no one to fake it for him. Back at the DMV, B209 was called. Virginia leaned back, smiling just a little. Let them sweat. Let them remember every time she reminded them. Put me in the room when the buyer's lawyers ask real questions. Let them fumble through spreadsheets she built with color-coded version tracking and cross-tab dependencies that only made sense if you'd lived inside the file for 3 weeks straight. Let them bluff, because bluffing works in poker. Not when you're talking about who owns the risk in a $400 million escrow clause. 10:46 a.m., the buyer's junior counsel asked about Clause 47B. Trent, now audibly cracking, muttered something about contingency triggers and not having that in front of him right now. Sonali leaned forward. Your redline markup from 2 weeks ago specifically referenced Virginia's summary memo, the one with the best case/worst case matrix. Does anyone have that? Trent turned to legal. Legal looked like they wanted to chew drywall. No, someone finally said. That was in Virginia's folder. Which version? Sonali asked. Legal glanced at Trent. She didn't transfer access, Trent said. Yet, she's out today. Out, Sonali repeated. On the biggest buyer-side call of the quarter. Yes, another long pause. Trent tried to smile. It looked like he'd just swallowed a stapler. Back at the DMV, Virginia's number was called. B211. She stood, calm as a monk, and walked to window 6. Clerk asked how her day was going. Fantastic, she said, because it was. For the first time in months, she didn't have to babysit grown men through basic due diligence. Didn't have to catch Trent rewriting legal language he didn't understand. Didn't have to coach Paige through how email attachments worked. She just had to renew her license and let her silence spread like fire in a locked server room. Back at the firm, the buyer's counsel excused themselves for a sidebar. Trent leaned on the table, sweating, mumbling to himself. Legal pulled out a folder and whispered something that made his eyes go wide. No one said it out loud yet, but everyone in that room knew what was coming. They were about to lose control of the narrative. And Virginia, she was just getting started. At 11:38 a.m., somewhere between a DMV parking lot and a blissfully unbothered lunch order, Virginia opened her email, not the work one, personal one, just a quick peek, not because she was worried, but because she was curious. Subject line, urgent escrow breakdown, can you confirm? She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The subject line alone told her the building was officially on fire. Inside HQ, Trent was sweating bullets and metaphors. In his haste to show leadership, he'd forwarded version 3.4 of the risk assessment document, one Virginia had scrapped 2 months ago, because it listed an incorrect litigation exposure line item. It also failed to reflect the updated indemnity thresholds based on last month's regulatory adjustment. Buyer's counsel spotted it instantly. This can't be the final version, Sonali said, brows knitting like bad wool. This shows $7.2 million in projected contingent liability from an IP dispute. Wasn't that resolved? Eagle glanced at Trent. Trent coughed. That's an outdated header. The numbers are current, just mislabeled. Sonali frowned. Then why is the indemnification cap still tied to pre-resolution exposure? Silence. In the corner, legal senior counsel audibly muttered, "Oh God." The COO tried to recover, fumbling through files, clicking furiously. He yanked open a cloud folder Virginia hadn't touched in weeks. Her backups were stored elsewhere, offline, encrypted, and crucially, not shared with Trent's new assistant, who once renamed a folder Virginia's old crap. Then Sonali hit them again. We also have conflicting data in the clause summary versus the disclosure schedule. One of these shows an earnout threshold based on gross revenue, the other based on net margin. Which is it? Another silence. The kind that doesn't land, it thuds. Back at her lunch table, Virginia bit into a club sandwich like she was listening to a ball game, instead of watching a Fortune 500 implosion play out via email breadcrumbs. Because she knew what version 3.4 would trigger. The buyer's team was methodical. They didn't react fast, but when they smelled contradiction, they dissected it like pre-law students on Adderall. Meanwhile, inside the glass fortress Trent still believed he controlled, the legal team scrambled. Someone whispered that Paige had tried to call Virginia's personal phone using her own and her boyfriend's. Both went straight to voicemail. We need the final escrow breakdown, Sonali said. Calm, measured, devastating. The buyer's holding firm on 4.8% exposure cap, and we can't confirm whether that's been tied to net or gross thresholds post-adjustment. We'll have that shortly, Trent said, voice strangled. From who? She asked. No one answered. Latest version of the escrow breakdown, version 7.1, was on Virginia's private drive, reviewed with the CFO, legal, and compliance. It hadn't been uploaded to the shared folders because it required a legal notation approval Virginia never got around to filing because Trent had pulled her off the project the day before. An uncluttered org chart, he'd said in his email to legal. Right now, that chart looked like spaghetti. Back at her lunch table, Virginia swirled the ice in her lemonade and considered logging in. Just for fun. Just to watch the panic unfold like a slow-motion car crash set to classical music. But no, let them call. Let them dig through folders she color-coded by fiscal year and tagged with footnotes. Let them flip pages and whisper and slowly realize the truth. You can't skip gravity. You can't delete a keystone and expect the arch to stand. At 12:06 p.m., Trent tried one last Hail Mary. He emailed the buyer's team directly, attaching a newly generated summary sheet labeled Escrow Breakdown Final 2. XLSX. It was riddled with errors. Wrong date format, misspelled variables. One cell even said TBD lol in red text. Sonali stared at it like it was radioactive. Then she turned to legal. Do you stand behind this? Legal didn't respond. They just looked away. Buyer's lead counsel closed their laptop. We'll reconvene this afternoon. We'll expect a clear chain of custody for every version of these documents and a confirmation of who exactly is leading this acquisition. The door didn't slam. It didn't need to. The silence afterward was louder than anything. At 12:18 p.m., Virginia got another email. Subject, we need you in the room. She didn't open that one either. She'd already been in the room. She built the damn room. Now she was just watching it collapse, one unforced error at a time. It was 3:47 p.m. when the elevator opened, and Virginia stepped onto the executive floor. Not fast, not theatrical, just present, like a ghost who'd finally decided to haunt in person. She wasn't in her usual blazer. No laptop bag slung over her shoulder. Just a charcoal trench coat and a single folder under one arm, slim, pristine, bothered by the heat storm of panic radiating down the hallway like a corporate Chernobyl. The receptionist looked up, startled. Oh, Virginia, hi. They've been looking for. Virginia gave a nod that landed like a gavel. I know. She turned and walked past finance. Past Trent's glass office, empty now, blinds drawn like a toddler playing hide and seek. Past the conference rooms where assistants whispered like they were planning a hostage negotiation. Heels clicked across the polished tile, slow, even a metronome against the static of chaos. She walked straight into legal. 3 heads shot up like whack-a-moles. One of them actually sighed in relief. Jesus Christ, you're here, muttered Jill, senior counsel. She looked like she hadn't blinked since breakfast. We've been there, it's... Virginia set the folder on the table. They're scrambling. Jill nodded like a bobblehead caught in an earthquake. Buyer's lawyer asked point blank, who owns compliance triggers? Who wrote the clause logic? Who holds sign-off on escrow clause activation? We told them it was you. Virginia unbuttoned her coat, that's correct. No bragging, no gloating, just confirmation, like a weather forecast. And Trent? Virginia asked, eyes scanning the room like she was doing inventory. Jill winced. He tried to spin it, said you were in a supportive role. Buyer's side didn't even flinch. Just said, then who signed Clause 47B? We told them. The PDF metadata doesn't lie. Of course it doesn't, Virginia murmured. She sat down, pulled out the contents of the folder, 3 sheets of paper and a flash drive. What's that? Asked legal. The clean version. Escrow breakdown. Triggers matrix. Final compliance flags, all with version control tracked back 6 months. Jill inhaled like she'd just found oxygen again. Oh, thank God. Should have had it, Virginia said evenly. But I wasn't sure who still needed it. The implication hung there like smoke. Legal didn't answer, just nodded. Someone knocked. It was Paige. Wide-eyed, cheeks blotchy from stress or crying or both. Trent wants to, he said to ask if you'll come to the boardroom. Virginia looked at the clock. 3:59 p.m. Perfect timing. She turned to Jill. Walk me in, Jill stood, straightening like a soldier told reinforcements had arrived. Together they stepped into the hall. People moved out of the way instinctively, not out of fear, but reverence. like a general returning to a battlefield she never lost. Inside the boardroom, the lights were too bright. Papers everywhere. CFO leaning on his elbows like he'd aged 10 years since sunrise. Trent was at the end of the table, jacket off, hair messy, eyes twitching between hope and dread. Virginia walked in, didn't sit, didn't speak. She handed Jill the flash drive, and Jill plugged it into the laptop at the end of the table. Version 7.1, Virginia said, loud enough for every executive and buyer-side observer to hear, with updated thresholds, red-line logic, and full signatory compliance notes. Trent opened his mouth. Virginia didn't even glance his way. Buyer's counsel leaned forward. Need confirmation that this version matches the one used in Clause 47B. Jill turned the screen toward them. Scroll to the metadata. They did, there it was. Name, Virginia Nolan, date 2 weeks ago. Time, 11:18 p.m. Signature hash matched. Buyer's side nodded. Then Jill added, and the flash drive's chain of custody begins and ends with her. No one else had access. A long silence. Virginia looked at no one and everyone. I'll walk you through any discrepancies, but you'll want to start on page 47. And with that, she took the head of the table. Not because anyone invited her, but because the deal demanded it. The boardroom was already in mid-spin when Virginia pushed open the door. Tense voices, muted speakerphone feedback, half-drunk cups of stale conference coffee. PowerPoint on screen, but no one looking at it. One buyer-side associate was scrolling on her phone like she was hunting for salvation in her inbox. Another was furiously scribbling notes that would probably become a lawsuit draft if this went sideways. Virginia didn't knock, didn't clear her throat, just entered like the room was hers, which, to anyone who understood what was really at stake, it was. She didn't make eye contact, didn't nod, didn't ask to speak. She simply walked to the head of the table, past Trent, whose face twitched between panic and some leftover arrogance he hadn't managed to choke down. And then she slid one printed sheet of paper, one, crisp, perfectly aligned, across the table to buyer's counsel. Page 47, she said, without inflection. Counsel picked it up, adjusted her glasses, read out loud, because of course she did. Escrow Clause 47B, all contingencies, including cap deviation, dispute holdbacks, revenue conversion thresholds, require written review by the named acquisition lead prior to any documentation release or valuation representation. She set the page down. Slowly, silence fell like a dropped gavel. Trent's mouth opened. No sound came out. Virginia still hadn't sat down. The buyer's lead counsel, a man who'd said maybe 5 words the entire call, finally looked up. We don't have that review on file. Jill from legal nodded, because it doesn't exist. She was excluded from the last documentation cycle. Trent cleared his throat. We assumed she had visibility. She's on the distribution list. No, I'm not, Virginia said flatly, eyes still on the table. I haven't received internal comms since the COO restricted access on Tuesday. Everyone turned to Trent. He blinked. We thought she was looped in. The buyer's counsel didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. Clearly not. Which voids this version of the agreement. It hit like a wrecking ball made of fine print. Someone at the far end of the table whispered, "Oh no." Virginia finally looked up. Not smug, not angry, just present. The deal's structure is only enforceable if Clause 47B TKS process is followed. You bypass the named signatory, which makes the most recent version non-compliant. So Nolly, the buyer's finance lead, tapped her pen once, twice, and we're proceeding with version 6.8, the last one with confirmed compliance sign-off. Trent paled. That version doesn't reflect the updated cap threshold. We'd lose 3% valuation. Then maybe next time, said buyer's counsel, don't remove the architect from the blueprint. The CEO let out a noise that sounded like a whimper smothered by a necktie. Legal said nothing. They just slid their copies of version 6.8 across the table, quiet as tombstones. Trent opened his laptop, fumbled through files, clearly trying to salvage anything he could. But it was done. Page 47 had spoken, and it didn't give a damn about his job title. Virginia still hadn't sat. She didn't need to, because right now, she was the room. Miss Nolan, the buyer's counsel said, folding her hands like she was about to announce court was in session, we'd like you to walk us through the valuation methodology, start to finish. Virginia nodded once. No scramble for notes, no deck to pull up. She already had the map in her head, etched like a tattoo no one ever saw. Revenue was normalized against pre-acquisition volatility, she began. Client churn was filtered out based on exit timeline, not just value. We applied a dual-index risk rating, one for legacy contracts, one for post-pandemic acquisition behavior. That gave us our first-tier weight. One of the buyer's associates leaned forward. Another pulled out a highlighter. Virginia continued, voice steady, pace unhurried. Second-tier weight came from exposure analysis, asset liabilities, pending litigation, overlapping jurisdictions. Everything was tied to a rollover clause capped at 7% variance with a one-year lookback. She paused only to let them catch up. No filler words, no fluff. Just architecture, clean and sharp and airtight. Built contingencies on 3 tracks: underperformance, data irregularity, and holdback lapse. Clause 47B covered all of them. It's the failsafe. Without it, the deal's integrity degrades. Sonali nodded. That aligns with what we saw in her memos. Those weren't shared in Trent's packet. Trent, who had been doing an impression of a stunned duck for the past 20 minutes, finally found his voice. I don't think we need to dwell on granular methodology. Macro narrative is, counsel cut him off like a guillotine. You've had the floor all morning. Now it's her turn. Virginia didn't even glance at him. She wasn't here to argue. She was here to finish. Gross margins were discounted against 2-year trailing volatility. That's what brought your initial offer down from $440 million to $412. Then, I flagged the API drift error in the audit, which preserved $8.3 million in projected revenue that your team almost cut. There was a shuffle of papers on the buyer's side. One of them whispered, that's why it didn't match. Trent tried again. Look, none of that was in the shared drive, exactly, counsel snapped. Then, turning to the room, asked coldly, was the interim ever present for any of these planning meetings? Legal didn't hesitate. No. Finance followed, blunt as a hammer. He wasn't cleared, wasn't needed. Virginia stood there in absolute control. Not smug, not loud, just undeniable. The room was hers now, not through drama, not through force, but through irrefutable gravity. Her calm was a language all its own. She didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to compete. She was the only one in the room who'd done the homework. The only one who could answer the questions no spreadsheet could. Sonali looked directly at her. Who else can validate the revised earn-out math? No one, Virginia answered plainly. I built it, from scratch, I vetted it, and I flagged the discrepancies your audit software missed. There was a silence that didn't feel like tension anymore. It felt like recognition. The buyer's counsel looked to the CEO. Are we continuing this call with her at the table? The CEO didn't even blink. Absolutely. Trent shrank into his chair like a man watching his own relevance get quietly escorted out of the building. Virginia remained standing. Her presence now wasn't a return, it was a reckoning. Because when the room finally realized who held the keys, they didn't argue. They just handed her the wheel. The buyer's counsel clicked her pen once. Then again. The sound echoed like a metronome across the silent room, tapping out the seconds it took for Trent to realize he was no longer the protagonist in this story, if he ever had been. She looked around slowly, her gaze landing on the CEO, then finance, then legal, like a judge surveying a courtroom where no one wanted to make eye contact. We're pausing here, she said finally, until your internal structure is clarified. Specifically, who's leading this acquisition? The room held its breath. Virginia didn't. She reached into the folder she'd been carrying since morning, the folder, and slid out a single sheet of paper. Letterhead, date stamped, titled simply, Project Gibraltar Internal Accountability Trail. She placed it in front of the board. Her tone was calm, surgical. If this is my last deal, I want it clear who got us here. The CEO leaned forward. Read the names listed. There was only one in every column, under lead architect, under risk mapping, under trigger author, under escrow gatekeeper. One name, Virginia Nolan. He stared at it like a man waking up from a coma. This was always hers, he said, voice low. We were stupid. Legal didn't flinch. She signed every compliance clause. She cleared every buyer-side red line. She flagged the earn-out trap that would have cut $12 million from our valuation. And she was removed from the deal mid-negotiation, the buyer's counsel added, voice now taking on that lethal stillness of someone preparing their final exhibit. Then she turned to Trent. You sidelined the signatory on an active acquisition. The air went cold. Trent opened his mouth, closed it. There was nothing left to say. His mistake wasn't arrogance. It wasn't ignorance. It was removing the one person who actually understood the architecture and assuming the structure would still stand. It didn't. And now, the people who mattered knew exactly why. Board didn't vote, they didn't discuss. The CFO, usually the quietest person in the room, spoke clearly and without ceremony. Virginia Nolan is now head of strategic acquisitions. Permanently. Effective immediately. No applause, just agreement. Final, irrefutable. Virginia didn't smile, she didn't thank them, she didn't shake hands. She simply nodded, turned toward the buyer's side, and said, "Shall we proceed with the corrected clause framework?" Sonali nodded. Gladly. As the call resumed, Trent stood up slowly, gathering his laptop, his notes, and what little dignity he had left. No one stopped him. No one said goodbye. He walked out of the room, invisible in a way that only people who once thought they were indispensable can be. Virginia sat. For the first time all day. She folded her coat over the back of the chair, opened her notes, and continued the call like nothing had happened. But everything had. Big thanks, you legends of the old office days. Subscribe to keep the switch-flicking chaos alive. Your ex-boss is shaking in their loafers.